today's two lectures in the Philippe Jabre lecture series in art history and curating. The goal of the lecture series is to bring distinguished practitioners, theoreticians from wherever they may happen to be, to discuss specifically something like the intersection or the overlap between art history and curating. That's the goal of this series. So we're very happy to have Professor Amanda Beech with us this evening. I'll also just remind you, on Wednesday at 6 o'clock we have the second speaker in the series, Nancy Ung from the University of Binghamton, who will be, the title of her talk is The Trouble with Mobility, the Complex History of the So-Called Indian Wedding Chair. That will be on Wednesday at, and that will be Auditorium A in West Hall, rather than here. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. I'll pass over to Angela.
Thank you for coming this evening, and it's my pleasure to welcome Amanda back to Beirut. You probably had an encounter with her work as part of the Homeworks program last year, and in the exhibition that Bassama Baroni curated. And in these 2 days, today and tomorrow, we'll have a chance to learn more about her practice, but also to share some of the historical and theoretical insights. Amanda Beech is an artist and writer who lives in Los Angeles. She's Dean of Critical Studies at Cal Arts in California. Drawing from popular culture, critical philosophy, and real events, her work manifests in different media, including critical writing, video installation, drawing, print, and sculpture. Using a range of compelling, rhetorical, and often dogmatic narratives and texts, Beech's work poses questions and propositions for what a new realist art can be in today's culture. That is, a work that can articulate a comprehension of reality without the terminal mirror of a human identity. And today's talk is titled Decisive Constructions, Art After the Crisis of the Image, that will engage with the central question of power, which in turn asks us to examine the way artworks manifest conceptual and sensory demands upon the communities that experience it. And tomorrow we'll be continuing the conversation in the frame of the workshop that takes place between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. in Building 37. Don't come if you haven't read many texts circulated, but come to the public event, even if you haven't read, at 5 p.m. In this room. We will be screening two works of Amanda, The Final Machine and Sanity Assassin, followed by a conversation between Amanda Ray Brassier and myself. And actually today, we're right after the talk, we're going to head to Ashkal Alwan for Suhaib Malik's talk, so you're welcome to join as well. Welcome.
Thank you. Is this picking up? Is that okay? Great, just let me know if you can hear me. I've got a little bit
sore throat, so I'm sorry about that. So just bear with me and shout out if I need to speak up. I just want to say, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I sincerely appreciate it, and it's fantastic to have an opportunity to be out here in Beirut, especially to work with Angela and Ray to do the workshop tomorrow, and also to be sharing this evening with Suhaib Malik. It should be an interesting two-parter of some hopeful correspondence that maybe we can map across this today. I also want to say thank you to some of the students at AUB who've been working with me on the first stage of a new project, and who've been working really hard and helping me lay the foundations for a new video work. So it's been a kind of larger collaboration with AUB, and one that Angela's been really supportive of and helpful with for quite a while now. So thank you again, Angela, for that. Often when I do two things when I talk, amongst other things, I guess, but I either do a kind of paper, like a piece of critical writing in a discursive panel situation, I guess, or I do a form of artist talk, and I thought it would be kind of interesting for me to try the artist talk version out today. I'm not gonna be showing a lot of video work in full version here in this session, because we're going to do a screening tomorrow night. But I wanted to take this opportunity to kind of contextualize my work within the conditions of the theme of these talks around the curatorial, the context of art history, and I guess to come at it as predominantly today as in my like kind of practitioner's hat from the studio, which is nonetheless a kind of space of thinking and conceptualization, of course. And I haven't really written anything out to tell you or to produce like some kind of coherent argument as one might when I was reading a paper. I thought I'd speak to the work, tell you about the work, and yes, that does involve some autobiography that may slide into anecdote at some points, so you'll have to excuse me for that. So I'm going to move through some images, concentrate on a couple of pieces of work in particular, and then before I finish, I'm going to show you one work in full, which is like a shorter piece that I made quite a while back. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to just kind of situate my practice and kind of show you and talk about some of the core themes that I've been working with for a very long time. And I know some of you here are students at least, and I guess I wanted to kind of, because I'm here at a university, I wanted to try and recapture my memories of being a student in a kind of sense of solidarity, that you're working through your own ideas and what that's like when you're really struggling to kind of think about what it is that you want to think about and do. And some of the issues that I'm going to mention here, such as freedom, liberalism, power, amongst other issues, are things that have kind of dogged my practice and my thinking for a long, long time. And over the years, I've tried to come up with particular, like, efficient ways of speaking to this, because it is a very multifaceted problem. So one of the things that I guess an area my practice comes from, and maybe this is just me, but I've spent a lot of time kind of complaining. A lot of my practice comes out of like seeing that something's wrong, something that I'm not happy with, something that really dissatisfies me, or I think is a contradiction. Something I can't abide. But it's something that then I have to articulate, like, well, what is the problem? What actually is wrong? And how can I think differently? So one of the core set of issues that I was always concerned with as a student on my undergraduate, on my graduate degrees, and even now is the kind of perceptions and norms and conventions that have manifest what we call critical artistic practice or critical thinking in and around art. And that also involves the curatorial. So I want to kind of like capture the art world within all of this. And one of the core problems that I can still identify is a kind of relation that is situated between art and the ineffable, or art and alterity, or art and the unknown, or art and the sublime, or we can use lots and lots of terms here. Art and indeterminacy, art and the glitch, the unknown, the great outdoors, all of these things, but the idea of that somehow art is correlated to, or has in its essential nature an ability to occupy the space that is beyond our understanding. And it's often claimed that because art is a special thing that can do that, it is this place in which we can then transform our understanding and produce new forms of thought. So I was skeptical of that artistic magic. I'm a kind of quite a practical person, and I was like, well, that sounds like a big ask for a particular set of identities. And I think the art world itself also recognized that, because what we see in the history of art is that art becomes self-aware, let's say. And then it starts to assess itself and to understand itself. It has a kind of self-consciousness about this very principle and task of art. So we get a lot of artworks that reflect this self-understanding. And what we see is, I can think of artworks that were made, say by Bruce Nauman, the idea of the repetitive act, the performative labor of art, all invest in a kind of tragic repetition of the conditions of language in the image, in a kind of self-reflection on their own limit capacities. So in Bruce Nauman, you get this moment where it kind of slips from the infinitude of language to a farcical and hysterical space that speaks to its limitation through the fact that one can constantly repeat the word no in works like Clown Torture, for example. So it's not so much like when I was a student that I'd go around saying, oh, I hate Bruce Nauman, or these works are terrible and I never want to see them. I was just more interested in the fact that they didn't kind of make sense to me in what they were proposing about language and about the conditions of knowledge. So whilst I can kind of go and enjoy them and maybe laugh at them or have some experience with them, they weren't giving me an experience of what I thought art could and should do in terms of my expectations. And I found that, as I've said here, there's a kind of redundant labor of the self, this idea of self-consciousness, plus this idea of art's essential negativity, produces a major problem. And what that is that art becomes a kind of mechanism for the destabilizing of itself as a form of power. And so art enjoys assessing itself, judging itself, telling us that what it can't do. And I find that to be quite a hubristic and an arrogant thing, to kind of know the conditions of what you can't do. I was like, well, how do you know that the limits of which you can define yourself within? So I found it, again, a kind of contradiction. And at the same time, this act of destabilizing the identity of art, not only is it a kind of pseudo-stable identity, or it's pseudo-destabilizing because it's actually a stable and dominant identity, but it was also the path to the political for art, that an art can symbolize the political as open by dint of its ability to be constantly indeterminate and unstable. So it produced a kind of theater of art that for me was dwelling in contradiction. So I was had all these kind of concerns about what a liberal artwork was when I was an undergraduate student. I was really, I was like looking at monuments like the Unknown Soldier and the idea of this claim to that art could be anything, that art is open, that art is tolerant, and all these forms of kind of liberal investments in what art could be. And I was worried about it because I saw a kind of deeper power that was organizing the open, which could sound like a kind of paranoia on my behalf. But for me, I was thinking, well, these systems are organized. There are rules here. And one thing that reminded me that there were rules about a liberal or a neoliberal politics of art was that I was really interested in totalitarian art. And I still am to some extent, but when I was an undergraduate, I was really involved in like looking at totalitarian art. And one of the reasons was because, and it's not because I was just fascinated by the spectacle of Hitler or Nazism or the regalia or anything like that, in that kind of fascinating fascism kind of way. I was more interested in the fact that there was artworks being made that did something very direct. And yes, we could call it propaganda. We might refer to it as social realism. But what I was interested in with this kind of work, this is an image of Joseph Torek's studio, and you can see a horse there, and then this monument, this massive horse. The kind of authority and power and the lack of fear that was built into a practice of making something that was so explicit was really interesting to me. And it was a massive counterpoint to the kind of paradigm of education that I'd been involved in. This kind of, if you make work, that the more abstract and effervescent your work, the more critical it is. It was this kind of weird equation that we'd been kind of given as students to kind of worry about. So, yes, here we have this, this kind of totalitarian art, this Nazi art. And, it's not that I wanted to go around making propaganda or advertising or art that was an agent of governmentality, whatever that government was. But I was just fascinated by the fact that here we have an art that isn't dwelling within a fear of an image, a fear of representation. So this is like crucial to me when I was kind of developing my work as a student. So I'm going to go through these key approaches, and then I'm going to just go straight into the work and go through a few pieces. So I'm not going to dwell on this too long. So one of the core questions that I still have for my practice is the question of disagreement. So how am I, or how does any work explicate the problems of the state in which we find ourselves and propose a different view? So here we have what seems to be kind of a different dynamic, a different direction, a kind of artwork that might be pulled into an artwork that is concerned with the problem, articulating a problem or dissatisfaction or disagreement with something, but at the same time proposing itself manifest as another way of looking and being. So how could that be? So that's the kind of problem that I'm still trying to think through. And one of the answers that I have for that is to approach this question through realism. And what I mean by that, I've been thinking for a long time and trying to think about proposing an art that is not oriented towards its own terminal and irreducible identity, but does not identify a future that is freed from normativity. So that might be an artwork that assumes that that freedom and agency and power is by definition a freedom from norms or freedom from ideology. And that's when we can kind of get in the realms of art producing kind of private fictions and fantasy and utopian kind of visions, or in other forms, novelty, nonsense, or forms that are claimed to be outside of the conditions of regular or conventional language forms. But I also didn't want to think about an artwork that was over-determining a constraint to ideology as fate, which I identify as a form of anti-realism. So I just want to say that when I say an art that's not oriented towards its own terminal and irreducible identity, what I'm talking about are these kind of things down here, which kind of explain this attempt to do some kind of realism. So I wanted to propose artworks that do not arrest contingency as a thing in itself or alienation as something to be overcome. But an artwork that does not sustain inaccess as a negative theology, or an art that is ironic, an art that is managing its self-consciousness, and again, that is doing this kind of self-assessment. So an artwork that has no fear of didacticism or mediation. And to understand art as we understand it in its Duchampian legacy, which is this kind of idea of an artwork as a structure of self-modification, self-estrangement, via a project of self-consciousness. So these are things that I'm thinking, well, they seem necessary to the production of art, but they're also insufficient. They're not sufficient grounds for art today. So art has a bottom line, I think, to think about its self-estrangement through a project of self-consciousness, but self-consciousness isn't a project in its own right. Okay, so its terminus isn't to know self. So this is what I've been trying to think through in the practice. So it's a kind of art without art as we know it. So this would mean that I'd need to pursue the role of a vigilant conceptualism as a participant in art, and to propose an art that determines itself as a form of reason in the world. And so the idea of art as a form of reason, as manifest reason, and as a project for reason is vital to this. And that kind of goes back to that problem that I first mentioned, which is this conventional association between art and unreason, or art and the ineffable, art and the space beyond that which we can think and that which we can reason. So I've never really thought that that's necessary for art to be hosting or manifesting a critical project. Okay, so they're the kind of big kind of framing questions that have been around for a long, long time, and also the kind of core proposition to what the work wants to be, right? Whether that works out or not is another thing, but it's certainly a kind of claim that the work's after. So I'm going to talk about a couple of works, and these also really focus in on this idea of the organization of social space and the idea of the artwork as working through an understanding of its own curation in space. So this is a video that I'm going to talk about, and it's called Statecraft, and it was made in 2008 in Harlow in Essex, and it was commissioned by Commissions East and supported by a few other people, so that's how it was produced. And what I've got some images of here are of a container, the regular kind of container that you can get, a shipping container. And the project was commissioned as part of a curatorial project by an artist called Roman Vasseur, and he was given the role of a curator of Harlow Newtown for a 2-year visiting artist, visiting curator project. And part of what he did was he then worked with other artists, including myself, and commissioned pieces. So it was like a wider curatorial networked project where we were asked to make works that were specifically in response to Harlow and that would manifest in Harlow. So at that time, Roman didn't quite know what he was going to do as a curator, but he spoke to a lot of people, he did his research, and he started to develop this project. And he realized that one thing that Harlow didn't have, which is kind of strange, is an art gallery. It had this weird kind of strange library museum kind of space, but it didn't have an art gallery. And I'll tell you why that's strange in a moment. But what Roman did was he worked with an artist called Diane Bauer, and they both produced a shipping container, and this was the gallery that would host the work. And over the time that Diane and Roman produced this imagery and this paraphernalia for this gallery, we also met a lot and did studio visits, and so they saw rushes of the video that I was making, and we kind of developed this as a kind of collaborative, curatorial and artistic project. And just to the right there, that's a production shot of the video itself. And here's a still. Now, Harlow is an interesting curatorial project in its own right. It's what's called in the UK as a new town. So when a lot of London was bombed in the Second World War, people found themselves devastated and homeless. And there was also, after the war, this utopian building moment, and a few towns were produced at that point. One of them was Milton Keynes, that you might have heard of, and Harlow was another. Now these towns are kind of have a kind of sad joke kind of quality to them. There's a kind of tragic dimension to them because they were so aspirational in their building. And as you can see here, we have this brutalist architecture in a kind of constructed socialist space that is a kind of mimicked Sienese campo, where the community would supposedly gather together and be together and look out onto the same vista and share the same vision and view. Harlow itself was curated. We can use that term for everything today. I think we curate wine, and anything can be curated, a lifestyle. But I think that Frederick Gibbard, the architect who produced Harlow, did it in a very what we see as a very traditional curatorial format. He invited other architects, and each one took a zone of Harlow and worked with it as a space. Frederick Gibbard himself, when he visited Harlow before it was built, he cycled. He had a bicycle. Thank you. He got on a bicycle, and he cycled through the fields because, of course, Harlow didn't exist. Right? It was fields and nature and streams and stuff, woods. He got on his bicycle, and this sounds like a myth, but according to his notebooks, it's true because I read them, because he made these notes as he went along. He had a notebook about this big, and he took 7 days, and he went on his bicycle around the fields, and he would stop and do a little mark and say, hospital, and then cycle along, school. And he mapped out the site in this kind of very strange, biblical 7 days in the making kind of way. Or 6, maybe he had a rest on the last day. So we have this kind of curatorial conceit of Harlow that's been mythologized through Sir Frederick Gibbard's vision. And one of the things that I was very interested in when I got to Harlow and I got a chance to look at what was going on there was that I wanted to produce a video that reflected the conditions of this utopian dream for the space, the socialist space. Now, one of the things about Harlow, and I still think it has the record, is that it had more artworks commissioned for it in its conception and its production than any other town that's ever been made. The artworks that were commissioned for Harlow were made by Barbara Hepworth, Lynn Chadwick. Henry Moore just lived down the road. He actually opened the town with a historian called Sir Kenneth Clarke. So the very idea of art was the core of this space. So what I did was I kind of worked through that narrative, and I made some sculptures that were like archaeological dig findings of the ruins of Lynn Chadwick and Barbara Hepworth sculptures, of fragments of British modernism. And I put them in the space that once had this kind of stuff in it. Most of the stuff had been vandalized and just like fallen away over the years. The other thing that I did was I also visited Sir Frederick Gibbard's house, and what was interesting about that is that here's Sir Frederick Gibbard inventing this socialist, brutalist space of equality and egalitarianism for the residents, the new would-be residents of this amazing community. And he lived on the edge of town, looking down over it on a hill, in this very strange James Bond-style villain retreat. And just before he'd done Harlow, he'd been asked to do the Bank of England, Coutts Bank. Thank you, Matt. He'd been asked to do Coutts Bank in the centre of London. And when he demolished the bank that was there before, he stole the neoclassical columns from the bank, put them in a kind of big lorry or truck, took them to his place in Harlow, and made a Victorian kind of weird grotto at the bottom of his garden and installed this neoclassical fairy tale world for him to delight in on his evenings and weekends. So here we've got someone building a utopian socialist vision, asking people to live in it, but at the same time living in this neoclassical retreat, looking down over it. That sounds like a contradiction, right? But I just thought, well, it's not. Because what I was thinking through when I visited both of these sites was the kind of dynamic of a neoliberal politics that was kind of skewered through both of these sites. And that the aesthetics of neoclassicism that I was greeted with in the grotto at Sir Frederick Gibbard's house was just a semantic difference to the brutalism that I was welcomed with in Harlow Town Centre. So I began to think about the conditions of Harlow, its life, and in particular, this shift, this moment where a utopian socialism was translated through the politics of neoliberalism against this neoclassical aesthetic. And I just couldn't help but think of Margaret Thatcher, the one-time Prime Minister of England, who at one point came out of number 10 Downing Street with Friedrich Hayek's book, saying there's no such thing as society. And I began to think about neoclassical economics, deregulation, the privatization of space, the reorganization of space, and how how it was always there through the conditions of these sites. So I wrote a script. I wrote a kind of essay. This is kind of what I do. And like I say, a lot of my work, whether it's me sitting here, whether it's my critical writing, or whether it's the artwork itself, manifests a form of complaint. It's kind of often pretty grumpy. And I have a good time with that. It doesn't make me sad. Okay, I like arguing, and I like the work to be argumentative and kind of live in that sense. So here's the neoclassical columns. You can see them there. And this is the interior of Gibbard's house. I dressed the interior of Gibbard's house to make it look like, like a porno fuck pad from like a really bad pulp movie, to pervert it somewhat, just like I perverted the kind of center of Harlow. Okay, so I'm going to show you a very, very small clip just to give you a sense of the work before we move on. And let's see if this works. Okay, that's the right video. So now I just need. This is a piece of the work. I'm just going to show you like 2 minutes. It's the piece that traverses from the center of Harlow to Gibbard's house. Okay. Can I get the lights, please? Thank you. Oh. Okay. So we'll stop it there and wait for the...
What happened?
I don't know. Oh, it's come back.
But when you go full screen,
Okay, it's not working.
okay, let's try VLC,
Yeah, we'll try a different player and see if that works.
It's always behaves differently.
Let's just move that. Do you want to do it?
Which one is that?
It's statecraft, so it's there. Thanks.
Oh,
It's not there.
Here?
Okay.
Now you can scroll.
Oh, it's really glitching. Oh, I need to stop it. How do you get to the... okay, I'll just push it through. Okay. No, it's not working.
Okay, this was working. When you go full screen somehow.
But we need full screen because...
Okay, sorry.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Angela. So I'm just gonna see if we can flip back to, there we go. There we go. Yeah.
From currency.
Yeah, we got it. Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to show you a clip of that to give you an idea, but you know, it's hard to get a full idea of the work because it does have this kind of abstract narrative that takes you from one space to another and gives this sense of this, again, this dynamic continuity between the two spaces that's kind of held together through the kind of rhetorical force of the text and the music and the imagery. I just kind of, I'm going to move on now, but I just wanted to say that a lot of the work I do, the kind of way I approach it is also like I'll write an essay, I'll develop some thinking, I'll be reading, I'll be making images, I'll be working in different formats, but a key part of it all is to discuss ideas with people and to work with people and debate things out and to kind of set up discursive fora. And over the years, each one of my artworks has kind of been deeply connected to a set of texts, sometimes books, whether that's an artist book or collaborations with people in terms of responding to the kind of motivations for the work or trying to describe or situate a context for it. And so these are just some of the books that I've produced over the years, whether they've been kind of strange folding out projects there at the bottom or catalogue essays for biennales and so on. I wanted to also go to another work, which, again, these are some cutout works that I've been making, and they're kind of recent. They're 2014, but I've been continually making them. This is a show at Catalyst Arts in Northern Ireland. And again, this set of works comes out of a larger theme, which also included the video Covenant Transport Move or Die, which was shown at Ashgal L1 last year and has recently been shown at the Baltic Museum in the UK. These works, they're burnt and cut out pieces of paper. I'm just going to move through them kind of quickly. And then they connect to this piece, Covenant Transport, because it's kind of strange. I've been living in LA for now 5 years. One of the things I see a lot every day are trucks, or the sides of trucks. And I just got more and more kind of interested in looking at the insignia, the institutional branding of these images that were extremely abstract. And they became a kind of interesting premise for me about the idea of what future institutions could be. And when I say the sides of trucks, I don't just mean like the word Coca-Cola or the name of any company that was using it, using the haulage, but also the idea that these things are worn and battered and they have on them shapes and pictures that are complete accidents. They also have graffiti on them. They kind of become these montages of their traversal of these spaces in their life. And so I kind of started to invent these institutional imaginings of institutions, okay, and slogans. And a lot of my work has also been very motivated by the, well, I don't exactly know how to classify him, but by Saul Bass. And Saul Bass was a graphic designer, but he also did a lot of the credits for movies. He did Vertigo, he did Casino, but he also invented in his graphic design AT&T logos, hundreds and hundreds of logos that you'll know that he invented. And so I was really fascinated by that traversal from graphic design, the insignia of institutions, to the space of video and lens-based media and moving imagery. So this work allowed me to kind of talk to it, but covenant transport in particular allowed me to think of this idea of what it is to be contracted to transport. And right at the beginning, I told you about some of the complaints I have about art as we are given it, art as we know it. And one of those is this idea that this kind of fetishization and idealization of mobility as a good. And I think that this idea of fluidity, liquidity, flexibility, the open, the idea that anything can be anything, was always, again, deeply troubling to me for many reasons. And one of the core reasons is it produces a kind of banality, and it makes any image arbitrary. So I kind of wanted to speak to that in this work. I wanted to produce this idea of the disagreement of the center of the work is with this idea that of a kind of love affair with mobility, a love affair with being able to move and change. And also this idea that the idea of art is an engine of change in its nature, rather than something that we have to kind of work on as a project or a labor. So that's the kind of root of the complaint in the work. But the root of the kind of claim, I guess, or the way that I would see the work extending beyond just being the object of a complaint, or the working out of a complaint, is that the work situates a kind of a claim to an understanding of a reality that is not the reality we live in, but is part of that reality. That is, so the given of the world that we live in is included in this world. This is not a world that is free from the given, and it's not a world that is free from norms, it's not a world that is free from ideology. It's instead a kind of weaving through, or an attempt to kind of navigate an articulation of that world itself. So it's a world that is kind of not the same as the one we live in, but has some participation within it, and it plays a part in the work. So I'm not going to show you this work, because I know maybe some of you have seen it at Ashkel L1, and also I know we're running out of time. So I'm just going to show you some production stills at Atwater, which is in Los Angeles. And it was also filmed in Marfa in Texas as part of a residency that I did. The work took about 1.5 years to make. My work usually takes a long time. I spend a lot of time editing. And there it is, here we are in Beirut. And that's an installation shot. It's a 5-channel piece. It's got 4 channels on a long screen to the left and 1 large screen on the right. And here it is installed in the UK more recently, and this was in a larger space in the Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art, which gave me the opportunity to develop the work further and to work on the LED kind of influence of the side screens that I had. So there you go, there's the LED on the left, and it's kind of transplanted onto the front, like a kind of mural for the work, more like a public artwork than what we might consider to be the temporality of video. So the idea of the experience or the curation of the work was crucial, and it's crucial to all the pieces, and they're often multi-channel works. When you walked into the space, of course, you encounter the big green wall, which is advertising itself. It's a kind of sloganeering of its own exhibition. And then you walk inside, and there are these copper plate etchings, which are developed from those cutout works, and that they pursue, again, these references to institutions that do not exist in forms of abstraction that are derived from LED, but also the sides of transportation. On the other side, opposite the copper plate, is this green wall, and on the tiny plinth is a text by the philosopher Reza Negarestani, who wrote an essay specifically for the show, and it was made in an edition of 300. So that's just one of the copper plates, which is reflecting the green wall. So they kind of were holding the green in their light because they're reflective. And we'll just move through them quite quickly. Yes, and we had some audience looking at the work. And then finally, before I finish with showing you a video, I just wanted to remind you that I have a kind of faux interactive video work that was a commission for the Reme Modern in Canada recently. And if you go on the Reme Modern website, you can see the work. And it's a kind of computer game that I invented. So I've become kind of more interested in using these LED kind of game-style scenarios that ask us to kind of think about, again, the kind of idea of art as forming its own institutions that are not the current manifestation we might think of the institution of art. So these are all kind of what I see as like active propositions for art as other forms of normativity, let's say. So I'm going to move just finally to a short video which is called We Never Close, and we'll finish with this and we can have maybe some questions. This was filmed in Las Vegas in 2006-07, and I thought it would be interesting because in terms of the curatorial, it's very much, well, whereas the other works I've shown you are very much about the experience of being with the work in a kind of forced, immersive, and often claustrophobic space where the works are pretty didactic and have this oppressive kind of quality, and the fact that they're telling you something. This work's kind of different because it's often not shown as a big installation. It's often shown on a smaller kind of screen in a gallery. But in itself, it tries to think through the disorientation of space within it. So it's kind of like an inside-out version of the curation of the other pieces. So I'm going to hope that this works. Oh, there we go. Okay, let's try it. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, fine.
I'll get out of the way now.
very happy if you've got any questions or you want me to kind of explain something a little bit further.
So we'll have about 10 minutes for discussion because we'll have a chance to engage more in the next 2 days. Planning to go to the other side of the town as well. So 2 or 3 questions perhaps. Yeah.
So right at the beginning, when you were going through the list of what you wanted and didn't want in art, can I ask you to expand on the question of the ineffable and art? Is it that you're against the ineffable generally, or the ineffable in art, or the pretensions of art in relation to ineffability?
Well, I guess it'd be in general. I mean, I just find that whenever it's called upon and it's utilised in any kind of condition, it sustains a kind of theology, or whether it's like the theology of the political or the image, and I find that it sustains a kind of very conservative notion of how we think and how we, and in the art world, of how we produce meaning. And it also links very much to me about this general problem of art making that confuses the idea of reference with inference.
So there's been, of course, over many, many years of art history, this idea that representation, as we talked about right at the beginning with the kind of totalitarian art moment, that representation is an evil thing. It is the product and the work of dominance. And in response to that, the art world has responded with a kind of forms of ambiguous abstractions that claim that they can escape the representational, and that's naive. So I guess what art practice kind of forgot or actually thought it could overcome was this idea that of meaning in itself. You know, that things that it could say that this image is pure, and it is beyond language. And so then we just get into kind of irony. And I think that's the kind of problem when one starts to kind of claim those things as manifest.
I have a question. I think one word that kept on coming to my mind that you avoided, or perhaps like it's strategic or just doesn't figure, is I guess what you're asking for is some form of an affirmative art.
Yeah.
To get out of the deadlock of negativity.
Yeah.
Could we, I mean, also given the way that you're using montage, the images, the pace, the juxtaposition of the images and words, could we talk about, I mean, capitalist realism in relation to your work as a kind of affirmative art of that takes its material from the existing sort of battlefield with the images?
Well, I'd love to hear more about your understanding of capitalist realism, but I will say for sure in terms of how I see the work, I see it as a very, even though I was saying that I have a lot of complaints and that my work was generally motivated by problems, I actually see the production of anything I do as a kind of construction of, or an attempt to construct another view. But one, as I say, that's not just about a kind of idea of relative difference to say, well, here's what I see to be going on now, so I'll do something different to that. You know, it's not that kind of, the idea of like novelty in and for itself. I mean, that seems very obvious to say. Who would ever do that? But of course, we see it all the time. And we also see it being championed and claimed. So for me, it's always been a question of what is real difference, what is substantive difference, and what is an art that can kind of have traction in the world, rather than produce a kind of realism that retreats to like a private psychology. And it's interesting to me because, you know, over my years of like reading and like researching as an artist, a character that I spent a lot of time with a long time ago in my work was Ernst Junger. And Ernst Junger was really interesting to me because he didn't, he was working through capital. He didn't say, well, I'm going to just demolish capital and here's a communism. And instead, he accepted the conditions of the kind of particular constraints of capital. But sadly, or maybe for some people, very, you know, the kind of exciting point of his work maybe is that it's kind of spectacular and mystical and kind of charismatic, and it's got this kind of reactionary, modernist, charismatic quality to it. But ultimately, it's a kind of, I guess, a kind of weird metaphysics that doesn't kind of manifest in the political. It manifests as his kind of philosophy only works in the form of like horror fiction or sci-fi. So for me, it was really important not to fall into those traps of thinking, well, here's my fiction, and it will always be played out at the level of a kind of private psychology. So what is it to kind of produce an artwork that has traction in the lived world? And that's a deeper and more difficult question. So, but for me, it is certainly a project that is a kind of constructivism. And I don't mean that in the, like I say, an art historical sense, but certainly in a kind of, a very simple sense, an engineering or a production, yeah.
The Frankfurt School people, nothing to say.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess, I guess we should head out, since
Okay.
There's going to be traffic for sure, and tomorrow we will converse further around your work and the art theoretical ideas. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coping with the video.